of the war in Ukraine. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
And I'm Millicent Walker.
Here are the headlines. The Russian strikes hit Lviv, Kyiv in the west, and Kharkiv and Kramatorsk in the east as Moscow's offensive continues.
Rescuers free 130 people from basement of shelled Mariupol theater. Plus, Ukrainian refugees fleeing into Poland reaches 2 million.
A warm welcome again. It's day 23 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Moscow's forces are still encircling 4 major cities. But according to reports, they're making only minimal progress in their advance.
Today, Russian strikes hit Kyiv, Lviv in the west, and Kharkiv and Kramatorsk in the east. But Western sources say the Russian troops are struggling with logistical supply problems and their failure to control Ukraine's airspace, while Ukrainian forces are hitting back with counterattacks of their own.
Here's a summary of the situation on the ground.
Russia fired several missiles near Lviv's international airport in western Ukraine this morning, destroying a nearby aircraft repair plant, according to local officials. Lviv is close to the Polish border and has been acting as a safe haven for thousands of refugees. Meanwhile, several major cities have also faced fresh aerial attacks. In the eastern city of Kharkiv, a university building and 2 blocks of flats were shelled, killing 1 person and injuring 11. Further south in Kramatorsk, 2 people were killed and 6 injured in a missile attack. In the capital, Kyiv, 1 person was killed after a downed missile exploded in a residential neighborhood. Ukraine's human rights chief says the first civilians who were sheltering in a bombed theater in Mariupol have emerged from the rubble. So far, 130 people have been rescued after the attack Ukraine blames on Russia. Tens of thousands of civilians are believed to be trapped there. Russia says separatists in eastern Ukraine, with help of its armed forces, are tightening the noose around the Ukrainian city. But US and UK defense officials say Russian forces have made no recent territorial advances and may be struggling with morale and logistical problems. And on peace talks, the Kremlin has accused Ukraine of trying to drag out negotiations, saying that Russia's delegation is showing readiness to work faster than the Ukrainian side. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov also reiterates criticism of US President Joe Biden's characterization of President Vladimir Putin as personal insults. He says Biden's comments were fueled by irritation, fatigue, and forgetfulness.
Well, the roots of the Russia-Ukraine conflict go back in history. In July 2021, President Putin wrote an article in which he emphasized the close historical and civilizational connections between the Russians and Ukrainians. Then later he emphasized that Ukraine has never been an independent country and was historically part of Russia.
Well, Professor of Diplomatic History in the Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos, Professor Abayemi Akinyeye joins us now virtually for more on this. Thank you for joining us on the program. Tell us, how far back does the root of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine go?
Thank you very much for having me. It goes very far back into history, because Ukraine, where you have Crimea, is a very strategic location to Russia. Russia had always wanted to, if not control Ukraine, to have Ukraine within its orbit of friendship and cordiality. As far back as 1853, Russia went to war over the Crimea, and this war dragged between 1853 to 1856. When it was resolved by the Treaty of Paris. Thereafter, after the First World War, between 1919 and 1922, Ukraine managed a precarious existence until it was integrated into the Soviet Union. Even though after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was among the number of states that constituted the Soviet Union, its existence has always been a major concern to Russia because of its strategic significance. Ukraine stands between the Black Sea, which in turn is an outlet to the Mediterranean Sea, which is a vital trade route to Russia and indeed many European countries. So these strategic considerations have always been a foreign concern in Russia's foreign policy. So the present crisis has a long history indeed.
And when Russia recognized the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, it was clear that Moscow was going to take matters head-on. But did you expect it to go for an all-out invasion of Ukraine?
It was a surprise, but the suspicion had always been there, that unless and until Ukraine is governed by a friendly country, Russia will not feel assured. In 2014, when the elected government was overthrown, Russia was disturbed, and this was what likely lied behind the support for the separatist movement. Russia's concern or goal was that the separatist movement will make Ukraine so weak that it will not be able to stand against any, it will not be able to be a foothold for any foreign country that is hostile to Russia. However, this appeared not to have been the case, and that was why Russia went all out. Going by the 2014 experience, one would have expected that the present invasion will be over within a very short time. But due to a combination of factors, poor intelligence, poor preparation, and a lot of lethargy on the part of the Russian troops, you are having what you are having.
Professor, I'm glad that you set, the stage for us, bringing us back into the history between the two countries, and having that at the back of your mind. What was it that Ukraine did wrong to warrant this war from Russia?
Please come again.
What did Ukraine do wrong? What did Ukraine do wrong to warrant the war from Russia, knowing the history between both countries?
Well, it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to win against Russia in spite of the overwhelming support. Both have gone beyond the line that they cannot easily win one way or the other. The best that can be expected is a negotiated settlement. The Western backers of Ukraine will not go all out to support Ukraine in a way that will make Ukraine to be able to win against Russia, as was
Professor, I think you're misunderstanding the question, Professor. Maybe I should just take it again. You already set the stage for us, helping us to understand, the relations between Russia and Ukraine, going down history lane. What is it that Ukraine did to Russia that warrants, this invasion, that warranted the invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
Ukraine's body language and intention to move closer to the EU and ultimately NATO. The application to join the membership of NATO is something that Russia will never countenance in any shape and form. Even though NATO and the United States of America are able to exercise military power from any part of the world because of the possession of nuclear weapons, the whole world is revolting against the use of nuclear weapons. So any potential conflict between Russia and any foreign power will be by conventional warfare. And the possession of nuclear weapons by Russia will be a deterrence. So for any country to constitute a credible threat to Russia, it needs the element of contiguity. The membership of EU and NATO will provide the basis for easy attack on Russia, and Russia will never countenance that. No country ever agrees to that. History has demonstrated that amply. For example, in 1945, when the Second World War was ending, and the United Nations was being formed, and France was being relegated to the background as a major power. All France did was to come to Africa here and fortify its naval base at Dakar. And then the signal was sent to the US that hostile intention was there, because Dakar happens to be the closest point of the Atlantic from where the United States can be attacked. The distance between Dakar and Mexico is just like the distance between Lagos and Maiduguri, which is 1,600 kilometers. And once you are in Mexico, you can easily attack the US. The US protested vehemently against this, and France had to have a rethink of the fortification of the naval base at Dakar. In 1962, the defunct Soviet Union attempted to have a base in Cuba, which is very close to the United States, thereby having contiguity and the element of credible threat to the United States. Of course, we all know what happened, and the Soviet Union had to retract from that venture. Similarly, in Nigeria, during the apartheid regime, Nigeria and the Republic of South Africa never saw eye to eye, and South Africa went to establish a base in Equatorial Guinea. You saw the reaction of Nigeria. Nigeria had to go there by a combination of crude force and consummate diplomacy to dissuade Equatorial Guinea from providing South Africa with a base. So the centrality and strategic significance of Ukraine to Russia is such that its membership of NATO, which will provide a foothold at the backyard of Russia, will never be countenanced by Russia.
Now, you do understand, the conversation. You do understand the conversation has moved now away from Ukraine's NATO membership and that of the EU to the humanitarian crisis that's already growing in Ukraine. The number of deaths, the death tolls, they keep going up, and then the Russian missiles, misguided missiles, they said, are hitting civilian populations. Russia has also threatened some other countries around Ukraine, telling them they will face the same fate, if they also decide or show any indication of joining NATO. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's the same principle of safeguarding one's backyard, the same element of proximity which will provide a credible threat to any foreign power to Russia. That's the reason Russia is doing that. In strategic studies, we talk of credible threats, which are three components: capability, conflict of interest, and contiguity. There is a standing conflict of interest between Russia because of its socio-political values and Western countries. So that interest is there. Then capability, of course, among the Western countries is the United States of America. So it's capable to fight any time. The only element lacking in credible threat to Russia is contiguity. All these countries bordering Russia, joining NATO or any hostile foreign country will provide that contiguity. And so Russia is sending the signal through the invasion of Ukraine to them that if you contemplate doing a similar thing like Ukraine, you'll be visited with the same fate. It's the same principle of denying any hostile country the element of contiguity to be able to constitute a credible threat to Russia.
Finally, Professor, does Ukraine really have a choice here? It said that it will negotiate but not surrender.
Yeah, that is a good development, to negotiate and not surrender. Negotiation, by definition, is the reaching of agreement through compromise. That means Ukraine will have to give up some of the views, some of the positions and values it now holds, and this will be agreeable to Russia. Both of them will agree. Negotiation, reaching agreement to compromise. Russia will give up some of its own positions, Ukraine will give up some of her own, and both of them will have a meeting point. And it depends on how far they are able to reach this agreement.
Professor of Diplomatic History in the Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos, Professor Abayomi Akinye, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
It's my pleasure.
Well, we're still talking and covering stories And developments out of Ukraine, Mary Ellen O'Connell, professor of international dispute resolution at the University of Notre Dame, says Russia's increasingly intense attacks on Ukraine indicate that President Vladimir Putin is no longer acting rationally, but there still may be hope for a negotiated settlement to the war. She says that the conflict is at a critical juncture and that Russia's failure to attain its military objectives provides an opportunity. O'Connell warns, however, it may take more attrition on both sides to reach a tipping point in talks. 3 weeks into the conflict, Russian troops have been halted at the gates of Kyiv, having taken heavy losses and failing to seize any of Ukraine's bigger cities, in a war Western officials say Moscow expected to win within days.
Right now, we're at a very sensitive point in the conflict. Russia has not done as well as it wanted to. That gives Ukraine some leverage in this conflict. They're not on the verge of being defeated, but they, of course, are suffering huge losses. And it's clear that the United States is not going to come in and intervene for them, and probably no other European countries either, to help rebalance the military conflict. So right now, there is real reason on both sides to reach a negotiated settlement with some real concessions that could support ongoing peace, but neither side has suffered enough, has enough reason to make those concessions yet. What I think needs to happen to give Ukraine more leverage in these negotiations is for Europe as a whole to finally cut off oil and gas purchases. That's the sanction that will really hit Russia the hardest. It's the one thing we can do outside the military context that will really support Ukraine in these negotiations and speed along a much better result through those talks.
And Australia and Japan have imposed more sanctions on Russian elites. Canberra added Russian billionaires Oleg Deripaska and Viktor Valsherberg and 11 banks and government entities to its sanctions list. In a statement, the Foreign Ministry says the inclusion of the Central Bank of Russia, Australia has now targeted all Russian government entities responsible for issuing and managing Russia's sovereign debt. Meanwhile, Tokyo has sanctioned 15 more Russians and 9 organizations, including state-owned arms exporter Rosaboron Export. Australia says it is working in close cooperation with international partners to increase sanctions pressure on oligarchs close to Russian president over the invasion of Ukraine.
We have placed sanctions on 11 additional Russian banks and government entities, and the majority of the country's banking assets are now covered by our sanctions, along with all of the entities that handle Russia's sovereign debt. Today's listing includes the Russian National Wealth Fund, the Russian Ministry of Finance. With our recent inclusion of the Central Bank of Russia, we have now targeted all Russian government entities that are responsible for issuing and managing Russia's sovereign debt. Those additional banks together account for approximately 80% of all banking assets in Russia. This continues our commitment to working very closely with international partners on imposing high costs on Russia, and that does include listing individuals of economic and strategic significance to Russia who have both benefited from and supported the Putin regime. We have, in addition to the 41 oligarchs and immediate family members on whom we had already placed targeted financial sanctions and travel bans, added 2 further individuals with links to business interests in Australia, Oleg Deripaska and Viktor Vekselberg. And in doing so, we continue that close cooperation with key international partners.
Still to come on the program, Russian President Vladimir Putin hails Crimea annexation and invasion of Ukraine with lessons on heroism. Once again. Welcome back to the program. Nigeria's ambassador to Russia, Professor Abdullahi Shehu, has met with a special representative of President Vladimir Putin in Africa, Mikhail Bogdanov, on an evacuation arrangements by the Russian government to assist in the evacuation of Nigerian students stuck in Kherson. And a statement highlighting the bilateral relations between both countries, which include trade, science, technology and others. The Russian government representative says Russia's Ministry of Education is willing to offer admissions to Nigerians who are willing to continue their education in the Russian Federation. Further, we assured Professor Shehu that Russia considers Nigeria an important country and partner in Africa and will continue to strengthen both countries' bilateral relations.
8 years after Russian troops seized Ukraine's southern region of Crimea, the event is being celebrated with flag-waving crowds in Moscow's Luzhniki Stadium and special lessons in schools. Making a special appearance before crowd, Russian President Vladimir Putin hailed what he calls a special operation in Ukraine. He has regularly used the anniversary to highlight love of the motherland. Officials said more than 200,000 people had gathered at the stadium, although the numbers could not be verified. He told the crowd, "We know what we have to do next. We'll definitely carry out all the plans we have made." But his address on state television suddenly cut to singer Oleg Gazmanov belting out the words "Forward Russia" in what the Kremlin later called a technical glitch.
И этим руководствовались люди, когда шли на референдум в Крыму и Севастополе.
Now, 3.2 million people have fled the conflict in Ukraine abroad. It's become Europe's fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. As we mentioned earlier, of that figure, 2 million have fled to neighboring Poland. The World Food Programme official says daily crosses into Poland have fallen by around half from a peak of about 100,000 daily. But more refugees are still expected to flee.
The country's food supply chain is falling apart. Movement of goods has slowed down due to insecurity and the reluctance of drivers to drive to places like Dnipro, let alone Mariupol or Sumy. We are especially concerned about the families in the encircled city of Mariupol, which is running out of its last reserves of food and water. Very little aid has been allowed into the city since it was encircled more than 2 weeks ago. With global food prices at an all-time high, WFP is also concerned about the impact of the Ukraine crisis on food security globally, especially hunger hotspots. The consequences of the conflict in Ukraine are radiating outwards, triggering a wave of collateral hunger across the globe. Russia and Ukraine alone account for almost 30% of global wheat trade. Those shipments are on hold now. Ukraine is the number 5 actually, producer and exporter of wheat. So that has a big impact. WFP buys almost half of its wheat, or has bought almost half of its wheat supplies worldwide from the Ukraine.
And as we had mentioned earlier, as Russia's invasion continues, Poland's border guard is saying more than 2 million refugees from Ukraine have crossed the country, most of them women and children. The sudden influx is almost twice what authorities said they had anticipated, increasing Poland's population by about 5% in less than a month. The VOA's Eastern Europe Bureau Chief, Miroslava Gonadze, is in Warsaw, Poland, and she joins us for more. Hi, Miroslava. 2 million refugees, we're told. A huge number of people who have fled into Poland since the invasion. How are authorities coping with the influx?
You know, I have been to the border just recently, and I have to say that I was amazed and impressed by organization of Polish government, how they organized everything. The flow of refugees are constant. The people are coming through the border not non-stopping, and the buses are coming. The police and the security people are helping them. There was nobody stuck, nobody there's no crises. Everything was very, very well organized. Generally, obviously, Poland is embracing all of the refugees, and they obviously were not expecting that many refugees. However, I have to say that Polish government is doing utmost important things. They are giving those refugees, Ukrainian refugees, a right to stay in this country, the right to work in this country, and the right for education. Ukrainian kids who came across the border, running from the war, are started their schooling this week, this Monday. So Polish government, when you are registered as a person who lived in this country, are giving money for like a stipend, first stipend for refugees, as well as health securities and so on. So basically, even with all the hassle and the difficulties, Polish government and Polish people are very welcoming to Ukrainian refugees.
Miroslava, in terms of the entry points, are there multiple points or just a single one?
No. There is 8 points, 8 entry points, border crossing between Poland and Ukraine and Poland. And all of those boarding, the crossing were organized. So people, when they are coming in, they are receiving information where they can go. There are buses who are taking them who wants to go to the shelter. They provide people with place to stay for a few days if they don't have anywhere to go, or people are going to the train station where the trains taking them further in Europe if they would like to. I have to say that the trains are free for those people as well. So a lot of people who have at least some relatives or some connections in other countries in Europe going there. There are a lot of reports that in Germany, people just waiting in airports and the train stations waiting for refugees, welcoming them to their homes, or creating, organizing some kind of accommodation and shelters. So basically, whole Europe right now feeling this crisis, feeling this war, because they have to cope with this. They have to help the Ukrainian people, and they're doing a very, very good job.
Miroslava, in the UK, the government is preparing people to take in refugees, citizens to take in refugees. I'm wondering if that's the same in Poland, because you have all of these numbers of people coming in, and many have to stay in shelters, as you rightly pointed out. But after that, what happens, especially those who have nowhere else to go in Poland, no family members, nowhere else to go in the rest of Europe? So what's the long-term plan here?
I'm not sure people understand, but honestly, the majority of those people who come here, they're hoping that the war ends and they can go back. Some of them, I talked to some of them, they have no place to go because their houses, their homes were bombarded, and they really lost all of their belongings. So, but if the government is letting people work in this country, and they're still work here, then they can provide for themselves, and then they can sustain themselves and live in this country. However, Warsaw and some other places, big cities, they are out of capacity, honestly, to take more. So other European countries have to pitch in. Honestly, Poland is the biggest platform for refugees. Southern countries like Italy and others, France, the refugees are going there, but not as massively as here. But everybody is pitching in.
And Poland has so far received at least 2 million refugees, and more are still expected beyond those borders. How many more can Poland take? Not forgetting that it was just a few years ago that there was an influx, from Africa and from the Middle East into many of the European countries.
The border controls and government does not report how many they still can take, but my understanding that they are trying to arrange with other European countries to help, as well as United States. United States said that they would be welcoming Ukrainian refugees to the United States. However, the legislation is not ready for that yet, and Poland per se is hoping for that as well. But we will have President Biden visit in this in Brussels, and possibly here next week. So maybe that would be the part of the discussion as well.
Perhaps staying with the humanitarian crisis, talk to us about what we heard earlier, and this is perhaps the first week or second week of the invasion, the sufferings of some refugees, particularly those of color, who are said to have passed away at the borders. I mean, what have you observed? What did you observe at the time?
I have to say that the border crossing where I was, Medica border crossing, it's like you have to cross the border by foot. I have not seen refugees, colored refugees. However, I talked to a couple of experts here, and I heard, and I'm planning actually to go to some churches who are helping particularly African students who left Ukraine. So we will report on that. We'll tell you more about how how they are feeling in this country.
And tell us, is Poland preparing for any sort of war, or, you know, are they anticipating that Russia would invade Poland, and are there any preparations?
My understanding, and yes, I was traveling across the country yesterday and day before yesterday, and I have to say that I saw a lot of military cars and equipment. Kind of felt like they are ready. We know how much NATO is boosting support for Poland and other European countries. Poland understands the critical position they are in. The Russia is threatening. I mean, basically, they are launching point for support for Ukraine, for military support and for humanitarian support. So Poland is actually embracing that. They understand that they are in critical position. However, they as well understand that they can be next, and that's why they are trying to stop this war from spreading around Europe. And that's why they understand the pain that Ukrainian people and Ukraine is suffering right now utmost.
Miroslava, the US already has, boots on the ground in Poland, as well as I think the UK and Germany, in anticipation of this war, this attack from Russia. And the Russian president does feel threatened, by their presence there already. So my question is, how are Ukrainian people preparing for, a possible attack from Russia? And then secondly, circling back to the humanitarian situation, I know that the EU does prepare, they're probably having meetings about this, about how to help support countries that are receiving huge numbers of refugees. So is Poland getting something from the continental bloc regarding that?
I would not give you a specific numbers. I unfortunately don't know specific numbers, but I know that there are discussion about it. And obviously, Poland would, it's a part of European Union, part of NATO. So basically, the other European countries have to pitch in and deal with the crisis. In terms of Putin feeling threatened, Putin threatened whole Europe. Putin threatened whole continent of Europe. And actually bombarding Ukraine and Ukrainian people, targeting schools and hospitals, and targeting population, because he realized that he cannot defeat Ukrainian army. So this is a really, really dire situation right now. And Polish people, here you don't feel that war, like in this town, you don't feel that the war is a few thousand kilometers from here. However, in mentally and in minds, they understand that they can be next.
Miroslava, I was wondering about the the Polish people themselves. I mean, Ukrainians were preparing, for a possible attack from Russia. But for the Polish people themselves, I know that the military is preparing, but people, are they, stocking up, or preparing, weapons, organizing themselves? Tell us what's going on.
I have not seen, and I have not talked to Polish people who are doing it. However, this is a good point to actually ask around what they are planning to. I think they feel a little bit more secure because NATO, they are part of NATO, and they are hoping that NATO would step in and defend them. But it's a good point that I should actually go around and ask people how they are preparing in case of war.
You've done a lot more, reporting on this already. Miroslava, thank you again for joining us on the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
The Lithuanian foreign minister says the strategical situation in the Baltics changed after Russia had started invading Ukraine. During a news conference with his Norwegian counterpart, Gabrielius Landsbergis said the Baltic states were convinced they needed to move from deterrence to a standing defense, and it has to come from NATO planning leadership. He also thanked Norwegians for an additional troop deployment to Lithuania on February 27th as part of a wider NATO build-up in the Baltic region following Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
We've covered the security situation in the Baltic region, where we are constantly trying to point out a strategically different situation of the Baltic region when it comes to defense. We are convinced in the Baltic states that we need to move from deterrence to a standing defense, and has to come from NATO planning leadership, that they would start looking into the region differently than they had throughout the last 2 decades. Norway is exceptionally good friend and ally for Lithuania and for Baltic states. That's the bottom line. And a minister being here and troops being in Rukla reinforces this alliance. It's a very important message that's being sent to the people of Lithuania.
It's a meaningless war in Ukraine, and we are united, condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. We call on Russia to end the war immediately.
I will need to now to talk with the protocol.
Well, French soldiers have disembarked in an Estonian airbase to serve in NATO operations in the region. The soldiers from the 7th Battalion of Alpine Hunters traveled to Estonia weeks in advance to take part in NATO's enhanced forward presence, which seeks to improve defense capabilities in the eastern part of the alliance. Article 5 of NATO means that any armed attack against one or more allied countries in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against the whole alliance. And consequently, member countries agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, will assist the party or parties so attacked.
They have invaded Ukraine. They have done it with 200,000 soldiers, with 20 armies, with a lot of different weapons, with precision strike and all this. And the second thing is that they have also presented ability to make grave miscalculations, grave. So if we take this as an analytical exercise and start to think, analyze, that how can we be sure that Russia will not invade, then, based on this evidence, we really don't have any, articulation or arguments to convincingly say that there is no way that Russia will try out Article 5. Even if we are convinced, then he has indicated that he can make a very wrong decisions. So then, in order for this not to happen, is we need to indicate that he will lose from the first minute, not by tripwire, not by reinforcing allied troops, but from the first second. And in order to assure this, we need to make sure that the level of troops will be sufficient, not only in Estonia, but in all 3 Baltic states. The activities they do will be convincing in peacetime. The reinforcement strategy, the logistics in place, the infrastructure in place will indicate this, that the war will start from the first minute. All the rhetorics, all the messaging from all the heads of state and government of NATO, and this is, by the way, happening, is clear from the first second. Article 5 will start to function, and it starts to function automatically. There won't be any time for discussions or elaboration.
You're watching Channels Television and our coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. When we return, US President Joe Biden warns Chinese President Xi Jinping against supporting Russia during a phone call. Please join us again. Welcome back. Well, we're hearing a report about China's President Xi Jinping and US President Joe Biden talks, video call. Prior to them talking, the US said Biden would urge China not to provide Russia with military equipment for its war in Ukraine. In their call, Xi told President Biden conflicts between states are in no one's interest and state-to-state relations cannot go to the stage of military hostilities. Xi also reportedly told President Biden that the U.S. must shoulder its international responsibilities and make efforts for world peace. Well, since the war began, China has tried to project a neutral stance. It has not condemned Russia's actions and has refused to label the attack an invasion. China's diplomats have criticized NATO expansion, accused the United States of fueling the conflict, but they have also called for a diplomatic solution.
In another development, Dr. Yu Ji, a senior research fellow in China from London's Chatham House, says China can no longer afford to sit on the fence when it comes to taking a stance on the Russian military operation in Ukraine. She says China's position has shifted from initial indifference towards showing more sympathy to Ukraine without openly denouncing Moscow. Dr. Yu Ji adds that the emerging superpower has found itself caught between its interests in maintaining a strategic and trading partnership with Russia and recognition of Russia, which has infringed international law.
Well, what we have observed so far, it seems to be China's position has shifted from initial indifference, leaning towards more showing sympathy towards Ukraine without openly denouncing Moscow. So China is now sitting on a diplomatic straddle that on the one hand, well, they felt because Russia has infringed international law, whereas on the other hand, and China also felt itself having the so-called comprehensive strategic partnership with Russia. And therefore, China is just in a very difficult situation of making a stance. So China is really hoping out of this crisis they'll be able to maintain that fine balance. But however, the fine balance will be very difficult for Beijing to maintain anyway at the end of the day. That Beijing, because bogged down by the international pressure, that Beijing will have to show some stance and to show its capability as being a responsible power in this case. Well, expect some concrete policy measures or mediation measures come out of this phone call from President Xi in here. Because what United States expect China to do, it is to openly denouncing Moscow. Whereas on the other hand, when we have Europe, and what Europe expecting China to perform is really to perform a mediation role in here. So United States have a different expectation to compare with Europe's in this case.
Let's talk some more about this. U.S. and international affairs analyst Calvin Dark joins us now. He is in Rabat, Morocco. Calvin, sorry we're intruding on your vacation, but you have been following the story. Great. You've been following developments out of Ukraine, and China's been on the fence about condemning Moscow. In fact, I think at some point China did declare its support for Russia. Well, not openly, though, but underneath the currents going on. Instead, it's called for peace and not confrontation. We see China doing that, not just with Russia, but with other countries. Do you think that this call between President Xi and President Biden could result in Beijing now denouncing Moscow or openly supporting it?
Well, I don't think the call makes the difference. But what it does show is that China is making sure that it's hedging its bets. That, yes, it has a relationship with Russia, a relationship that's been growing, a relationship that's been improving. But we have to remember they're not quite allies yet. And I know that Russia understands that they're not willing to go too far in support of Russia in this Ukraine invasion because that will isolate them on the world stage. Then they need more than just Russia as allies and partners economically, security-wise, and politically.
And as people watch, Russia's military operation in Ukraine, they're also thinking about China and Taiwan and watching what the lessons China is learning from this. If Russia succeeds in its invasion, what sort of message do you think will go out first to China and then to Taiwan?
Well, I think that's one of the main motivations behind the U.S.'s reaction in this situation, because we all understand that whatever Vladimir Putin is allowed to do, whenever it stops, people are going to take that as a roadmap of what they're allowed to do, whether that applies to Taiwan or there are other places around the world, on the African continent, on the European continent as well, where there are people wondering that if countries encroach on territorial integrity, what will be the international community's reaction? So yes, I think everybody is watching that, particularly in Taiwan, to see what will be the real reaction beyond the words and the threats from leaders in the West and the United States.
Also, Calvin, this call comes days after the U.S. suggested China has expressed some openness to providing Russia with requested military and financial assistance as part of its war in Ukraine. If China were to provide assistance to Russia, what would be the implications of this?
Well, if you take for what his words were, Secretary Blinken, and then followed up by the White House, the consequences will be dire if China does help Russia, partly because the U.S. and Western powers in Europe obviously don't want to have to go further than sanctions, and any help that China gives Russia will undermine those sanctions. So we know at least that there's the promise that the consequences will be dire, but as we've been waiting to see every day, what does it actually mean? What will specifically the U.S. actually do if China does that? How will they retaliate?
And another thing is the relationship, Biden and Xi's first known discussion in months. Do you think that it will draw them closer, do you think?
I'm always an optimist, so I'm hopeful it will draw them closer. What I'm more hopeful about is that the U.S. and China will be able to work out and improve its issues and its relationships, not apart from what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, because it's going to be part of the relationship, but one that isn't so dependent on it, so that in the U.S. economically, that we can continue to figure out our relationship with China. As you know, we're in an election year this year, the 2022 midterms, and that's a really big issue here or in the United States. So I hope this call will be a step in the right direction, but I hope that the U.S.-China relationship won't be defined just by what's happening with Russia and Ukraine.
Well, the U.S. and Russia do go way back. I mean, probably even more prominent during President Donald Trump's time in office when he, led that spat between the U.S. and Russia, U.S. and China, accusing China of stealing, intel and all of that. But moving forward, though, we have seen China support Russia in this, well, behind the scenes anyway, supporting Russia in this invasion of Ukraine. But President Joe Biden apparently isn't receiving the support that he actually needs, I think, from world leaders. There were reports last week of the U.S. president calling on the Saudi Arabian leader and that of UAE and them not picking up his call. So him having this conversation with President Xi, what does that mean, for U.S.-China relations, and what does that mean for Ukraine?
Well, I think for U.S.-China relations, what the U.S. has done pretty clear through Secretary Blinken is let China know that because of what's happening in Ukraine, China has to make a decision. Now, that decision might look like neutrality. It definitely can't look like being the one major ally that Russia can trust. Now, it remains to be seen if China makes the calculation that they're deepening their relationship with Russia is worth worsening their relationship with the United States. But further than that, as we see, the crisis in Ukraine continuing, we're going to really have a dichotomy in the world. It's kind of the George W. Bush mentality of you're either with us or you're against us, and that's going to really take an effect between U.S. and China because, as you know, money talks, and between the U.S. and China, there's a huge economic relationship that we're still trying to repair from the last administration.
U.S. and international affairs analyst Calvin Dark, always a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you, and continue to enjoy your holiday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Oh, that's just it. Diplomacy never sleeps. Russian state-backed news channel RT has had its license to broadcast in the UK revoked with immediate effect by media regulator Ofcom. A watchdog said RT's parent body, Ano TV Novosti, was not fit and proper to hold a UK broadcast license. RT's coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been under investigation by Ofcom. The channel had already disappeared from UK screens. RT, formerly named Russia Today, called Ofcom a tool of the government. The channel became unavailable on all UK broadcast platforms earlier this month as a result of a ban imposed by the European Union.
And that's our program this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker.
And I'm Amarachi Ubani.